Hello, everyone. I'm Janine Donnelly, Manager of Webinars for IBM Systems Magazine. And on behalf of IBM Systems Magazine, I'd like to welcome you to our presentation. We will be holding a Q&A session at the end of the webinar. However, you may ask a question at any time during the event by entering it into the Q&A panel. If you experience technical difficulties during the webinar, please use the Q&A panel to alert us, and someone will assist you. You may download a PDF version of the slide deck by clicking on the drop-down menu labeled Event Resources. You'll find that on the left side of your screen. Know that you can download those right from the platform without being disconnected from the webinar. Today's webinar, CICS Integration and Analytics, is sponsored by Hostbridge Technology. Our featured speaker today is Russ Tubner. Russ is CEO and co-founder of Hostbridge, a provider of CICS integration, orchestration, modernization, and analytics software and services. His pioneering work in CICS integration includes bringing JavaScript to the mainframe and a U.S. patent pertaining to XML enablement of CICS applications. So without further ado, Russ, I'll turn the presentation over to you.
Janine, thank you very much. Thank you very much for the opportunity to make this presentation today. And most of all, thank you to everyone in the audience. It's always really gratifying to see the number of people who are in attendance. So I really appreciate you taking the time. I know that for some of you, just scanning the geographies represented by the attendees, that some of you are probably working after hours listening to this webcast, so thank you especially for being with us today. What we're going to be talking about today, as Janine mentioned, is CICS Integration Analytics. Now, this phrase, integration analytics, is something that we've really coined or began using quite frequently over the last year to 2 years. And I'm going to unwrap what we mean by that. First, let me just introduce the company just a bit. You can go to our website and learn all you really need to know about Hostbridge, but we are a company that's been in business since 2000, so well over 20 years old. We are focused on helping large organizations or small organizations, but organizations who have a continued and ongoing investment in CICS-based applications, and helping those organizations expose those mission-critical applications across application programming interfaces, or APIs. Along the way, as Janine mentioned, we've done some pioneering work in bringing JavaScript onto the mainframe as an integration technology. We have a couple of different patents that we have worked on and that undergird many of our product offerings. Most recently, we were awarded a patent related to some of our work in this space that we're now calling integration analytics. Integration analytics, to us, kind of fills a growing gap. And this gap is essentially kind of the space between what's going on in, we'll call it the hybrid IT world or the distributed world. And in that world, we have really good analytics to help us understand all the things that are going on in that distributed side. We also have pretty good products, pretty good analytics that help us zoom in on just what's going on inside the mainframe. And we'll kind of show a diagram that highlights that in a minute. But the point here is that what we're trying to do is fill a gap, and it's a growing gap. So when we say integration analytics, we're trying to focus on analytics and the information that helps an organization understand how the things outside the mainframe impact the things inside the mainframe. In essence, we want to connect the dots between what ends up being the left side of a diagram to the right side of a diagram. And we'll look at that in a minute. But one of the things we'd like to do is start with a little bit of input from you. And so we'd like to know how many of your CICS applications actually participate as part of what you would consider a hybrid IT application. We'd like to know whether or not, or to what extent this is your reality. Another way you could think of answering this question is, what percentage of your total CICS transactions are really being driven from the hybrid IT side of your world? So with that, Janine, I'm going to click over to the Surveys tab and let you launch that. It looks like we already have a number of explanation or a number of answers coming up here. So let's just let it settle here for a minute. And as we're doing this, I might just comment that this concept of hybrid IT is kind of the current way of describing what we've really been experiencing all along, and that is a highly heterogeneous mixture of applications where anyone who owns a mainframe today also owns a laundry list of other technologies. And for most, if not all of those organizations, both the distributed technologies and the mainframe technologies are combining together to form hybrid environments and what we would call hybrid applications.
All right, Russ, I think we have a quorum here. I'm going to send the results out to the audience.
Okay, great. Well, this is interesting. How many of your CICS applications participate as part of a hybrid IT application? I think it's fascinating that the number that I don't know is the big winner. That's really, really interesting to me. It's either I don't know or the second one is 80% or more. That's also really interesting. For those of you in the 80% or more category, clearly you understand the need, or probably are very sensitive to the need to understand integration analytics. And for those in the I don't know category, it may just be that being able to see what's going on between your hybrid world and the mainframe world might help you calibrate what is happening and be able to figure out if this is impacting you or not. So that's really insightful. Thank you all very much for responding to that. So again, what we're talking about here when it comes to integration analytics is trying to understand the impact of the left side of this diagram to the right side of the diagram, to your mainframe application environment. And as we've said, it's all about knowing what's happening there and how it impacts what's happening here. And so really, integration analytics fits right there in the middle. Now, I want to just pause here for a minute and say that many of you, and in fact, we have some customers on this call, many of you know us as HostBridge as the provider of an integration platform that runs on CICS. What we're talking about today in terms of integration analytics and our offerings in this space is really completely separate. In fact, we now have customers who are using our transaction analytics connector, or the integration analytics capability we provide, but who don't have our integration engine running on CICS. There's no necessary connection between the two, other than the fact that if you use our analytics platform to understand the integration, you might find uses for better or different integration approaches. But integration analytics is trying to put a microscope right there in the middle. Now, we think there's plenty of evidence out there as to why this is important. In fact, we launched a sort of ongoing survey last month, And the responses are still coming in, but the results are fairly telling. Now, we cast this survey out, particularly in terms of the intersection between mainframe-based applications and RPA, and by that I mean robotic process automation. RPA, if you were to Google that right now, you would find that over the last few years, it's kind of been an exploding category of technology that has grown up kind of in the hybrid IT world, not necessarily in the mainframe world. And what it seeks to do is to allow organizations to create robotic processes, or bots as we call them, in order to do many of the tasks that human beings are doing today. And what was interesting is that in our survey responses thus far, more than 80% of these organizations' RPA bots are interacting with the mainframe. What that tells me is if you're on this call and you are responsible for the care of mainframe-based, CICS-based applications, more than likely, in fact, I'd probably bet a little money on it, more than likely, some or a lot of your transaction load is actually being driven by RPA or RPA-like components in your network. A second interesting fact from the survey thus far is that most customers believe that automation is increasing their mainframe transaction volume. Also, this is no surprise, but it needs to be something of a wake-up call for those of us who care about efficient integration, and that is that the typical means for an RPA platform to communicate with a mainframe-based application is via terminal emulation and screen scraping. That should concern you. Another thing is that RPA budgets going forward, apart from the initial expenditure, the average, right now the numbers are coming in that the average of these organizations, they're spending more than $1 million pursuing their RPA initiatives annually. And we think that this is very indicative and directionally accurate as to what we see in the marketplace and interacting with customers day to day. So again, integration analytics is really all about trying to provide a solid kind of end-to-end view, a connect-the-dots view of what's really driving your mainframe activity. We want to be able to assess these sorts of cause-effect relationships. And we're going to, by the way, just to let you know, we're going to drill down on some use cases now, and we're going to end up showing you some actual data that comes off of our analytics dashboards. And I'll just say up front, it's kind of, whenever we do a presentation for a large audience like this, it's a little frustrating simply because it's really difficult to do live demonstrations of the analytics platforms. But if anyone is more interested in being able to see this live, just give us a call, contact us. We'll be more than happy to set up a WebEx or a Zoom call and actually show you what the integration analytics platform looks like live, sort of in person. And in fact, later on we'll talk about we'd be more than happy to use some of your data with this platform. So why is integration analytics important? Well, clearly we've already, I think, tacitly assumed that mainframes are key participants in hybrid IT strategies in the real world. And the second bullet is really important. Not all non-mainframe applications are good citizens. That's just a fact. And so integration analytics lets you identify maybe the offenders or identify opportunities to optimize and remediate and develop better, more high-performing integrations. Now, let me go through a couple of use cases to let you know what we've been doing in some organizations just in the last 18 months. One use case, in fact, they were a very early customer, almost 2 years ago, was an auto insurer, and they have a very elegant platform to allow both insurance agents as well as individuals add vehicle information to a policy. But what they noticed was that there seemed to be some sort of a cause-effect relationship between adding a vehicle through this self-service mechanism and the mainframe resources. That was something they didn't expect. It was hard to forecast. It was difficult to manage. They saw all these really oddball fluctuations. And so they really felt like they needed to connect the dots. And they had a very technical mindset looking at this. They wanted to make sure that they were deploying all their mainframe MIPS most efficiently. So as a result of using our integration analytics platform, we were able to reveal that adding one vehicle via the web portal spawned, when it was all said and done, about 7,000 DB2 calls from CICS applications, which, due to the nature of the CICS application, triggered about 14,000 TCB switches during the interval of interactions for adding that policy, which burned about 28 million unnecessary instructions. It didn't take long for that customer to call the provider of that application and request a change to the application. Another case that we've seen is in the public sector. This public sector customer, they were a large municipal, one of the largest cities in America. They were seeing unexplained spikes in their CICS workload. There were all sorts of increased processing costs. They saw real-time bottlenecks in terms of what the customers were seeing and employees were seeing at their various types of self-service portals. And really, the processing during some intervals of time was impacting other important workload. Essentially, what integration analytics revealed is that they had a lot of applications in that, represented by the cloud and the gears in the cloud, that were just slamming requests to CICS in order to invoke individual transactions. And whenever we see that, and this is something that our integration analytics platform looks at very carefully, whenever we see that, we also generate some data as to the potential benefit of doing that sort of orchestration or automation on the platform. And so for that particular public sector client, we did make a recommendation that whether they used our software to do it or not, they need to move away from this sort of an approach where things are being orchestrated from outside the mainframe to this approach where they're being orchestrated inside the mainframe at memory-to-memory speeds. This same customer had another issue that they were talking to us about, and although there's not enough detail here to really necessarily talk about too specifically, just know that the blue line represents the volume of the transactions, and the red line represented the CPU required to run those transactions. Well, as you can see, for an extended period of time, they were very concerned that their CPU cost to run that transaction load was very high. Now, bear in mind that those transactions were being driven from a hybrid application. It was actually an application running on a .NET server that's sending HTTP requests into the mainframe. And they were concerned that CPU consumption was just too high. Well, we installed the integration analytics platform and began to gather data. And lo and behold, we did find the problem. And what it was is that this is an organization that when they upgraded to the most recent IBM System Z hardware, they enabled the package of features that we kind of collectively refer to as pervasive encryption. Some of those features are certainly implemented by RACF. Now, and one of the features that they enabled was, and forgive me for, it's pretty technical, was they enabled what's referred to as KDF AES as the actual cryptographic technique. Well, the problem is that what they didn't know was that the CPU time that was being consumed had to do with the fact that they made that choice, the fact that they were implementing KDF-AES and some very important CICS maintenance had not been applied. So what integration analytics was able to say, to show us, was that the consumption of CPU time was completely tied to the user authentication process and correlated to all the HTTP workload coming into the mainframe. And then that let us look internally under the covers of CICS and see that it really boiled down to this one issue. They did not have the correct maintenance installed to optimally support KDF-AES. As you can see, after applying the maintenance, CPU consumption based for the volume of the transaction dropped significantly. Another example, use case number 3, we're actually going to camp on a little bit more because this is becoming a big part of what we're helping customers see and fix. This is a global technology supply chain management company. They called me about 18 months ago, almost 2 years now, and said, Russ, we have a question. We invite you to help us understand the following. Our business is growing quite nicely. So the business volume over time, it's growing great. However, our transaction volume is growing exponentially, or seems to always grow exponentially relative to our business volume. Well, this is not an uncommon scenario, but this was a perfect situation to begin to see if we could use our integration analytics software to be able to figure out and deduce why that was occurring. Now, what the analytics revealed is that they had many different types of automation components running in their distributed environment. Actually, one of the most common automation components they had running were Excel macros. They had a lot of macros that were running on employees' desktops. And what those macros were doing was using a PC-based terminal emulator to then log on to the mainframe and be able to interact with the CICS application and screen scrape all sorts of data from those applications. They were also just beginning their journey using a formal RPA platform, which is UiPath in that particular organization. But anytime you use a distributed component, whether it's an Excel macro or a modern RPA bot, anytime you use that to orchestrate hundreds or thousands of these fine-grained interactions with the mainframe, 3 things are true. Efficiency goes down, latency goes through the roof, and the overall cost of ownership goes up. Now, contrast that with a different approach, which is what for a number of use cases we saw that we recommended, and that is they need to change the metaphor. Instead of having a macro or a bot orchestrate thousands of fine-grained interactions with the mainframe, they need to have the macro or the bot just make one simple API call to the mainframe. Then let's do the orchestration and interaction at memory-to-memory speed, at microsecond speed, and then let's return a single response. That will drive up efficiency. Efficiency goes up, latency falls through the floor, and we'll show you that in a minute, and the overall cost profile goes down as well. Now, this was so successful in seeing things that under the covers at that particular organization that we began to, they began to see things that were somewhat outside the realm of belief. We saw, in fact, I'll go back to this one. I say here macros and bots doing hundreds or thousands of interactions with a mainframe. We found one that was doing a little over 30,000 transactions to the mainframe over an interval of time. So this can really get out of hand quick. So we began to try to figure out how could we find these things? How can we kind of go whale hunting, so to speak? How do we identify these heavy hitter use cases by being able to drill down in a day, an hour, and a minute and see all of this activity going on? Now, this is the point in the presentation where I just love to switch to a live demo. And unfortunately, I can't do that right now, but count on the fact that I would love to show you this live rather than kind of static slides. But when we use our integration analytics platform, the first thing we do is that we deduce or suss out from all the SMF 110 data what we call the DNA of these robotic process automation sequences, or just these automation sequences. Now, I dearly hope that your monitor is large enough where you can see some of this. But on that first line there, you can see that what we've deduced is that there was an RPA, a sequence of activity. It started at a given time. It stopped at a given time. It ran for 22 minutes and 3 seconds. And during that interval of time, this robotic activity, this automated process, ran almost 10,000 transactions. Now, the difference between that RPA duration column and the RPA TX duration is this. The RPA duration is the amount of time it took that endpoint to run those 10,000 transactions. RPA transaction duration is the actual amount of time that those transactions consumed. So in other words, whatever this is probably an Excel macro. It spent 22 minutes running 10,000 transactions, and those 10,000 transactions only took 1 minute and 1 second in reality to run. These are the sorts of things that we are now seeing every day. We also then kind of deduce out what the DNA really is. And so in that RPA DNA column, you can see that what happened here is that the automation object, whatever it was, it ran a transaction called ICIS, pressing the enter key 9,929 times. Now, if you go down to the next example there, you can see something similar. This RPA activity ran 3,638 transactions, and it was a little more sophisticated, obviously. It ran a transaction called TL, then ICIS, then it bounced back to menu, and then it kept going. And this very predictable sequence of interactions ran for 5 minutes, and in reality, those transactions really only took 11 seconds. So this is kind of step one. We deduce and we form these DNA activity chains automatically. Now, once we have this DNA of these robotic processes, we essentially tag it. We create a marker so that we can, let me make sure I get the slide here, so that we can begin to look for these signatures over longer periods of time. Now, this particular customer wanted to look for the whales, wanted to look for the worst case scenarios. And so we created a set of dashboards that in this one, it looked on the vertical axis or the horizontal axis, that's RPA total duration in seconds. That's how long it actually took in real time. And then CPU time on the left. So you can imagine that anything in the upper right hand corner of that, of this chart, took both the longest in real time and the longest in CPU time. And so the way this particular dashboard works is I can now click on that big red bubble in the upper right hand corner, and I can drill down to exactly what that RPA sequence is, where it's running, where it's coming from, who's doing it even, and reveal the DNA of it so that a subject matter expert can really consider remediation or optimization strategies. Now I'm going to go back one slide to just say that I mentioned the important role of an application subject matter expert, because while our tool can definitely show you the DNA of this robotic activity, obviously I don't know for this customer what the ICIS transaction is. I don't know what IHST is. That requires a subject matter expert. But we're kind of batting 1,000 right now, because whenever we show this DNA to a subject matter expert, they usually have an aha moment where they say, oh, I know what they're doing. They're screen scraping this, that, or the other and trying to get this data. And then once they have that moment where they can say, oh, I know what they're trying to do, at that moment, that's when they can begin to consider other more efficient alternatives. So again, if we were doing this live, we would actually be able to show you this, but one of the things we do is we actually analyze this RPA activity down to the minute level. So you can see in this particular time frame, it happened to be on a Thursday, July 30th in the morning. Let's say at 11:40 a.m., there were 25 active concurrent RPA activities or bots running against this CICS region during that 1 minute interval. Now, with all of, when you look at this, and in fact, if we did this on your system, you'll be surprised what you find, what you learn. And the next question usually is, where do I focus my attention? And so we have another dashboard that includes some rather sophisticated Pareto charts that let us be able to look at the macro signatures that really are the most impactful. So what we want to do is give someone enough tools to be able to go, okay, this is the first thing we're going to do, this is the second, this is the third, and everything else is minor compared to that. So those are just some of the visualization tools we do, but it all starts with being able to deduce the DNA of this sort of automated activity. Okay, let me take a breath here. So what are we trying to do? We're really trying to create sufficient visibility and visualization to let you assess operational impact, the operational impact of how your hybrid world is impacting your mainframe and CICS environment. We want to be able to estimate the costs of suboptimal integration, both in terms of CPU time and real time, elapsed time. In fact, in the most recent version that we just released of the dashboards, we'll actually take your machine model type and model, and then we can use the sum total of CPU time from these various automations, or all this RPA activity, and we can tell you how many MIPS or MSUs it's costing you to run that workload that way. And of course, the objective is to optimize this hybrid IT integration. We take the hybrid IT world as a given these days, but it has been put together sometimes in ways that are non-optimal and frankly quite inefficient and very expensive. Now, the particular solution, how we remediate that, how we optimize it will vary. But as we've already seen, sometimes it's just as simple as being able to determine or assess and measure the cost of an automation pattern that looks like this versus one that looks like this, where instead of flooding the mainframe with all these individual transaction requests, making a single API request to the mainframe and doing all that interaction at memory-to-memory speeds. Now, again, not to hit this point too many times, but this really matters. So for example, I mentioned UiPath earlier. UiPath is one of the, if not the most prominent RPA platform in many large organizations. And so we've done a substantial amount of work with UiPath. And this is just an illustration. We took a sample IBM CICS application called the Trader app, and we automated it using the UiPath automation platform. And to do a particular set of work that only involved running like 18 to 20 transactions, that sequence took almost 1 minute of time. Now, when we did it the other way, when we had UiPath send a single API request to the mainframe, and then we did the automation under the covers of CICS, and then send back a single response, UiPath reported that the elapsed time went from 58 seconds to 2 seconds. The point being, this really matters. Now, interestingly enough, if you look at that same activity on the inside of the mainframe, it really only took about 500 milliseconds. That extra second and a half that UiPath thinks is there is really just its overhead in forming the HTTP API request, sending it out, and then getting it back, and then producing this little thing in the user interface. So it's not unfair to say that we went from a process taking a minute to a process taking a second. That's the kind of performance improvement that just simply changing the way you orchestrate activity can occur. That's a potential benefit. So let's begin to kind of come to the home stretch. But before we end, let's do another poll. I would like to know, I mean, this is kind of an interesting question for us, obviously, is what kind of visibility do you have into this sort of end-to-end performance of your hybrid IT applications? In other words, do you have this level of kind of DNA and analytic information? Now, I promise you, if you say you don't have it or very little, no one's going to call you on the phone today. But we really do. We really are trying to gauge whether or not organizations have this sort of information today or not. So Janine, let's stop here just for a minute. I'm going to go back over to the survey tab, and let's click on the next survey. And it looks like some people are already answering. Well, now this is not surprising. I don't think we've pushed this out to you yet as our audience, but I don't know is still the big winner, and none and very little are also there. We have some. No one has complete visibility, it looks like. But Janine, I think this is ready to push out.
All right, here we go.
So as you can see, I don't know is the big winner. None and very little kind of come in come in there. Some and quite a bit. That's good. If you're in the quite a bit category, that's excellent because that's where you need to be. Very few people have complete visibility, but having quite a bit, that's really important. So excellent. Well, as we think, or at least we've certainly attempted to try to make the case that integration analytics really does matter. And we would like to make an offer. We started doing this a couple of weeks ago, and we've already been taken up on this offer by a handful of customers, and so that's what we'll be doing this afternoon, in fact, our team. But the foundation of this sort of integration analytics is SMF 110 data. And then optionally, we have a very lightweight CICS component called Transaction Analytics Connector that runs inside of CICS that augments the SMF 110 data. one of the ways to think of the transaction analytics connector is that it helps you exploit a feature of CICS called CICS transaction tracking. CICS transaction tracking was a feature that kind of crept into the product late version 4 and then became more robust in early version 5. And part of that was it defined some new fields in an SMF 110 record that let us keep track of what we refer to as origin data. The problem is that out of the box, CICS doesn't or rarely fills in those fields with any useful information. So what the analytics connector does is we extract origin data or metadata from these external requests. We annotate or we add them to the correct origin data fields so that they end up being included in the SMF 110 data. It's optional. So what we, for example, did with one organization, last week they sent us some SMF 110 data. We did a basic analysis on it. We presented it back to them via a Zoom conference call. Then on the basis of that, they decided to install HTAC, just a free demonstration copy of HTAC to be able to augment that data. Then they're going to send us some additional data, and we'll go at it again. And we'd like to offer that to anyone who's taken the time to attend this call. We would love to invite you to have a conversation about doing this. It's very simple. All we need to do is be able to have a brief conversation that we'll talk about in a minute, and it's really quite painless. So, do you need integration analytics? I think we all realize it's probably important, but we would definitely urge you to take a look in this area if you have unexplained spikes in performance or workload, if you have limited visibility as to what's really driving the CICS workload, or if you have high and unexplained volume from screen-based apps. Those are all kind of leading indicators that this may be of value for you. So as we said, we'd love to help you dip your toe into this water by sending us some SMF records. What we'll do is have a brief phone call. I'll be on that call with some other people on our team. We'll talk about your transaction volumes, whether you have TORs, AORs, what's your region situation look like, how transactions are being driven into your CICS environment. And we'll come up with a recommendation. Maybe it's to send us an hour of SMF data. Maybe it's to send us a day. We'll make that call together. We'll assist you in providing or sending that data to us, and then we'll analyze it. And if necessary, if you're interested, certainly provide a free trial of the HTAC software. But we want you to learn from this process. So the analysis of your SMF 110 records and engaging in this process costs nothing. To learn more, please feel free to hit our website. There's a particular landing page. You can click on that right now, and it'll take you there to some information. There's a kind of a primer there about integration analytics. Or by all means, feel free to reach out to me or anyone else on the HostBridge team. We would love to visit with you about this. I've been in this industry a long time, and I can tell you that this has been a venture. This has been a journey that has been really exciting for us because it has been so helpful for customers. I don't think I've experienced quite as many aha moments with customers over the last 2 years as they've actually been able to see and measure what's really going on in the manner that the hybrid IT world is integrating with mainframe apps. Janine, with that, I think I'm going to take a sip of water and let's answer some questions.
Great, Russ. We have quite a few, so let's get started. The first question is, how much SMF data and analysis is required to get meaningful results from integration analysis?
Excellent question. It depends on your volume. I like to have a nice chunk of, I don't know, 250,000 transactions, something like that. So, for some of our customers, that might be an hour, 15 minutes. But I like to see enough. So for a high volume customer, it'll definitely be an hour. For a lower volume customer, for example, we worked with one 2 weeks ago, and because they were lower volume, they're only running about 500,000 transactions per day. We said send us a full day because it doesn't cost us anything more, and the more data we have, the more reliable we're able to deduce out these RPA sequences. So in an introductory phone call, we'd kind of decide that together and pick if it's an hour or a day or somewhere in between.
Great. Let's take this one. Hopefully I'll get these anagrams right, but we have applications that use a mix of MQBridge / batch to CICS using, I think it's EXCI, concurrently, so batch transaction file, as integration methods. So would your analytics be able to integrate these into a dashboard to illustrate, in quotes, contention?
I don't think we have done precisely that with the focus on the contention issue to date with any customer, but we certainly have all the data. Now, when it comes to MQ, we have to be very careful that we can extract the necessary correlation tokens and make sure that we can get all that correlated all the way through to CICS. So we'll want to kind of understand how all those components interlock together. But yes, by the time it gets into the SMF data, and then we take that data down to the analytics platform, we can certainly analyze concurrency. That's not really an issue. So we can, because the analytics platform we use, which is Spelunk, lets us be able to do that. So once we have the data, doing concurrency analysis is certainly in scope.
Okay. The next question, how will it impact cost and performance? Because what the general feeling is after intervention of RPA solution, the transaction response time may be delayed.
Not sure. I might want to pursue this question just a little bit more because how will it impact cost and performance? Let me actually go back to a slide. Let's look at this slide right here. Now, and I'm not saying that this is the use case that this person is asking from, but let's just take this as a sample, and that is, let's imagine that we have automation components somewhere in the hybrid, in the non-mainframe world, and let's imagine that it's an Excel macro that is sending hundreds or initiating hundreds of transactions to the mainframe. Well, the first thing that happens is the latency is extremely high. So when we talk about improving performance, we always think of it in two categories. One is real time, and the other is processing efficiency or CPU time. So in this case, there's really no doubt that running hundreds or running transactions via orchestration from something outside the mainframe is far, far slower in terms of latency and real time than running those exact same transactions, automating them from the inside of the mainframe. And it's aptly illustrated by this diagram that shows that in this case, if you just take that very first one, this was some sort of an automation object, an Excel macro, that to the end user, they perceived that doing this activity took 22 minutes. In reality, it only needed to take 1 minute. 1 minute to do that work. Now, let me be clear. I'm not arguing that the that the most efficient way to do this particular work is to run 10,000 ICIS transactions. Arguably, I would think that this should not be. I mean, is it really worth 22 minutes of real time and 24 seconds of CPU time to get whatever data they wanted from those 10,000 screens? I think we could make a pretty good argument that no, there's no way that any of us would think that that's the most efficient, effective way to provide that information, whatever it might be, to that end user. So our job with the dashboards is to be able to put a finger on the costs, and then we can't always automatically prescribe what the solution is, but that's where we would rely upon you as a subject matter expert to make the call. Now, by the way, I will tell you this, at this particular customer, they saw that line, it said 24 seconds to do that activity. They figured out what the end user was actually doing, and lo and behold, they figured out that they can do that through a single transaction and a bunch of DB2 calls for drastically less CPU time. So yeah, what the efficiency gains might be will vary on the use case, but our experience thus far says that with every customer we've worked with, we always find some significant opportunities for efficiency and performance gains and cost reductions.
Great. Next question. Will integration analytics help identify some of the shadow IT projects and activities that are occurring within our company?
Yes, it will. Now, I don't have a screenshot of this, but you'll notice that we know where this activity is coming from down to certainly the VTAM logical unit name. And in fact, there's another dashboard that shows us all the way down to the source IP address. And so we're able to know exactly what servers, what activity this is coming from. Now, I can't necessarily say that this activity is coming from, let's say, an Excel macro versus a UiPath server. However, because we can show the IP address, it's not difficult within most organizations to be able to trace that back to the exact server. So in fact, we have some customers who have used this tool to go back to the owner of maybe the UiPath server and engage in a dialogue. It's not that the distributed user using UiPath is doing anything wrong. It's just their means of integration with the mainframe is inefficient. So yes, our goal is to always give you enough information to know where this is coming from and to be able to know what the impact is on the mainframe. So as we say, you can kind of connect those dots and really see what is going on kind of in the shadow IT world.
Great. Someone asks, why can we not simply use some of our existing mainframe performance monitoring tools to do what you described?
Well, sadly, they just don't oftentimes show this. So, for example, at one of our customers, they're a big shop. They have every tool. They have great tools. They've got tools from BMC. They've got tools from IBM. They've got SysView. They've got everything. But the problem is they can see all the transactions. So, for example, they can see the fact that ICIS ran 10,000 times, but they really have a hard time understanding the context, kind of the business unit. Or take as an example, that second one that I show on this RPA dashboard screen. They can see the fact that IC31 ran this many times, or IHST ran that many times. But seeing them in this operational context where now a subject matter expert can look at that pattern of transactions and go, oh, I see what they're trying to do. That's really the aha moment, because it just zooming in on the gory details of the efficiency of a given transaction, like ICIS or whatever it is, that really doesn't answer anything. I mean, it might be nice to know that ICIS is really efficient until you realize that people are using that as kind of a building block and running it tens of thousands of times to do screen scraping. Well, at that point, you want to see what they're really trying to accomplish and say, let's look at that as a business requirement, and then let's then try to meet that business requirement in a more efficient way.
Great. Next person asks, is Spelunk a prerequisite to doing integration analytics?
Well, today, it's a good question. Today, our approach is rooted in Splunk. I can say two things about that. Before we went too far down this path, we contacted a representative set of our customers, and we determined that virtually all of our customers already had Splunk licensed in the organization. However, the minority were using Splunk for any sort of mainframe operational analysis. So we just decided that since most large organizations already have Splunk in-house for some reason, that it was probably the right platform for us to initially use. Now, having said that, we are actively looking at other platforms. We have a number of customers who view Splunk as less desirable than Elk, for example, the Elastic platform. So we're kind of looking at that, but all of the dashboards, if you were to send us your data, we crunch it, we'll do a Zoom with you, you'll be watching us operate Splunk.
Great. Okay, Russ, I'm going to go back to this slide as we take this hopefully last question. Not hopefully last, but time for this last question. In your view, what person or part of the IT organization is the best owner of an integration analytics initiative?
Ooh, that's a loaded question. I would, it all depends on the organization. I'll beg out that way. Certainly, someone allied with the, someone who has a view, someone who really does have a stake in the ownership or in the optimization across the hybrid world. In other words, we have customers where integration analytics is owned by the person who owns the mainframe. We have another customer where it's really owned by a deputy who reports to the CIO. We have other organizations where it's the kind of the architecture, the enterprise architecture organization that really looks at this sort of analytic information and how these components interact for better or worse. So it kind of depends. I would say this, there's no necessary, just because you have Splunk in your organization doesn't mean that the Splunk group necessarily is the right place to own integration analytics, because Splunk is just a means to an end. The right group to own integration analytics is someone who's chartered with the responsibility of making sure that the hybrid IT environment in the organization operates efficiently and cost effectively.
Great. That's all we have time for today. So I want to thank everyone for attending today's webinar and for your great questions. And Russ, I want to thank you for sharing your expertise with everyone today. Later this week, we will be sending out a follow-up email with a link to the recording of today's webinar, so please watch for that. That concludes our webinar. Thanks again. Have a great day and stay well.